Боем взяли город Брянск, город весь прошли, и последней улицы название прочли. А название такое, прям слово боевое.
Hi, this is Misha, and for part 5 in our Red October series, we're going to take another look at the Russian submachine guns from World War II. Now, we have one video from about a year ago with some of it, but I wanted to kind of revisit and get more into the history, because the submachine gun was very, very important for Russia during that war. In my hands is actually not a Russian submachine gun. This is a British Lanchester. And we'll do an actual video on it. I've had it for a few years and been meaning to bring it out. But the reason I have this is it's the closest thing to the Russian PPD34 series that was developed by Ditiev, and it both guns, both the Lanchester and the PPD, were heavily influenced, nearly copies of the German MP28 Bergmann, which itself was just an updated version of the original MP18 from World War I, which was one of the first submachine guns ever put into mass production. The PPD went into production in 1935, and it was the first successful submachine gun to be chambered for the 7.62x25 Tokarev cartridge. It was much like this gun here. It had a lot of the same lines as the Bergmann. You know, it had a milled, it was made of mostly all milled parts. It had a shroud that pretty much fully encased the barrel. This obviously is just an extension for it being a semi-auto only version. But the biggest difference between the original MP28 and the Lanchester and the PPD was that the PPD fed vertically. It took a drum mag or a 25 round stick mag here. Now, the drum mags originally introduced with the PPD were actually, they had a neck to them, not unlike some of the early German drum mags. The original PPD34 would be superseded by the PPD34-38, which was simplified for mass production. The major difference, if you look at pictures, is that the barrel shroud will change. The cuts will be simplified on the 38 version. These guns were fine for peacetime. By Russian standards, the PPDs were very well made. They used machined parts, and they took about 13.5 man-hours to create. Well, after Russia took them into Finland during the Winter War of 1939-1940, the final version, the PPD40, was released, which tried to correct some of the deficiencies. The gun was found to be a little sensitive and jammed, especially the drum magazines due to the neck. They copied the Suomi, the KP31 Suomi magazine, so they went to a neckless drum for the PPD40. But production would actually not last very long for it. By 1941, it would go out of full-scale production, and only about 100,000 of the PPDs would be made in total, and they were officially retired from Red Army service at the end of World War II. So it never went much of anywhere, and that was pretty much it. But you don't hear much about the PPDs, and so I wanted to mention them. But what replaced them is this here. This is the PPSh41. Now, this was made by Georgy Shpagin, and it was really the first truly successful Russian submachine gun. When it was introduced, it fed from a 71 round drum. We have one here. I can shake it out of its pouch. There. Shove this critter in. Now, this is a semi-auto made by T&W, so it has a longer barrel. Originally, this would have about a 10.5 inch barrel. This one is, of course, 16 to be legal. We have a full shroud. We have a single piece wood stock. Like the PPD, it was select fire. Like the SVT-40, it actually has a folding mag release, so they would try to keep the mags from getting dropped out. This was introduced in 1941, but once the Germans invaded, it really took hold in Russia. It was designed with a lot of influence from the Suomi, which again Russians encountered in the Winter War and saw how effective it was. So when they designed the PPSh41, they took a lot of cues. Mostly its 71 round drum mag is not interchangeable with the Suomi's, of course, because this is in 7.62x25 and the Suomi is in 9mm, but it is a very similar design. Well, what happened when the Germans invaded with Operation Barbarossa, Russians had to retreat, and they lost a lot of factories, a lot of resources, a lot of material, including military factories and arms. So they needed guns, and they needed them fast, and the PPSh41 was an excellent submachine gun to have. It only took about 7.5 man-hours to create one. It used a lot of stamped steel instead of machine steel, and it could be turned out by almost anyone. There were very few specialized parts, so these could kind of be made using a cottage industry, and they did. By 1942, Russian factories were turning out 3,000 of these a day. So they were using these to replace lost weapons due to all the retreats and capturing by the Germans. In fact, the Germans liked it so much they rechambered some of these for 9mm Luger and designated them as the MP41. So some were actually even redone, and that's easy to do with the PPSh41 because the barrel comes out very easily. This whole gun is very easy to field strip and maintain. Also, for some reason, you can use it as a chair. But, yeah. Oh, another fun fact. Sometimes when they made barrels for these, they would take a Mosin Nagant 9130 barrel and cut it in half and make 2 PPSh41 barrels out of it. But this was the standard submachine gun for the Red Army during World War II. They would basically take them out of production when the war ended, but even by that point, they had over 6 million made. So it was mass-produced on a very large scale, even by Russian standards. Simple, reliable. Sometimes they would have whole squads armed with these. They would usually send them behind tanks as kind of a mopping up squad. It wasn't the most accurate gun in the world, but it made up for it by a high volume of fire, especially because of this 75 round drum. The drum was reasonably reliable, but like most drums, it's heavy and very slow to reload. So what they ended up doing, take this little critter out here. In 1942, they would introduce a stick mag for it. I really need 3 hands, don't I? Or maybe 4. I mean, if you want your wishing, you might as well wish for more, right? They would introduce a 35 round stick mag. Now, interestingly, this is a double stack but single feed magazine. And we'll get into why that's important later, but that did make it a little harder to load. But they had to make it a single feed to work with the mag well on the PPSh. Put this one in. So it's kind of neat when you get your mag in, it automatically folds this catch up too. So the mag would come into use around 1942 and would stay in use all the way through after World War II. And it was really more effective. I mean, yeah, you're cutting your ammunition capacity in half, but it was much cheaper and easier to produce, much lighter, and more reliable. But yeah, the Russian PPSh41, definitely one of the most iconic guns, submachine guns from World War II for any country, and definitely for Russian. I first shot a full auto one of these around 2003 and just fell in love with it. The shroud is very iconic. It feels good. It's kind of feels like a little rifle. I knew I could never afford a full auto, so I was just thrilled when a reliable semi-automatic came out through T&W. Several people have made semi-auto versions of these. One of the earliest ones was probably the IO, SR41, but those were pretty dubious. They could be made to run by a good gunsmith, but out of the box they were pretty meh. Wiselight made one as well, which was better, but in my experience the T&Ws were consistently the better made. They're not 100% foolproof because this is a conversion, but it seems like they were the best made. But yeah, the Russian PPSh41, and these would stay in Red Army service through the 50s for a brief time, but this was mostly a World War II submachine gun. It would also be used outside of Russia by other Commonwealth nations, including Poland and Bulgaria and China, Vietnam, Korea, and most of them would just use surplus Russian guns. A few of them would make their own. But a really neat gun. The 10.5-inch barrel really lets the 7.62 round achieve great velocities. The barrels on these are chrome lined, which made maintenance much easier. Oh, I forgot to mention, there is a storage compartment in the buttstock here, which is kind of neat. It allows for a 2-piece cleaning rod and a takedown tool. So they did utilize the stock. But yeah, they produced these and they did it quick and cheap. And they were easy to keep in service. Alright, we'll move on. And for our final Russian submachine gun from World War II, we have the PPS43. Now this was designed by Alexei Sudeyev actually during the siege of Leningrad. The plans to design the submachine gun dated before the siege, but when the siege kicked into gear, the manufacturing and the design of manufacturing actually continued. The PPS was never meant to replace the PPSh, it was meant to supplement it. It needed to be lighter and more compact because it was going to be issued to reconnaissance type units, second line people. Basically they just needed a more compact submachine gun for special type units and soldiers. So they came up with this, and it also needed to be cheaper and faster to mass produce and less resource intensive. And it's a very remarkable story, so I suggest you, if you're interested, look it up how the PPS was developed. But you know, this gun was made in a city under siege. And sometimes, you know, with the prototypes, they would make these, and to test them, they would just send them to the front line, which wasn't far from the factory. The PPS was made of all stamped steel, or at least the majority was stamped steel. Obviously, the bolt and the barrel are still machined, but it was stamped steel. The original prototype, which went into limited production, was known as the PPS42, and about 50,000 of those were made from 1942 through early 1943. It was similar to this, except it had a little bit longer barrel by about 1/2 inch. It also had a longer stock, and the receiver and the shroud were two separate pieces. So after they tested it out and they tinkered with it a bit, they came up with the PPS43. And that's what I'm holding here. This is the semi-automatic version made in Radom, Poland. It was imported by IO. It's called the PPS43C. And it's actually made from an original submachine gun on a new semi-auto only receiver with the semi-auto trigger group, but most of the parts on this are original submachine gun. The PPS43 actually used half the amount of steel as the PPSh41. It also took under 3 man-hours to make, so you could make twice as many in half the time essentially, and that was really a nice thing. It was still an open bolt design, although this is the semi-auto only for being a civilian version. Unlike the PPD and PPSh41 though, the PPS was full auto only. It has a top folding stock. Again, since this is a civilian one, this is welded closed, but normally you just press this latch button and unfold it, and you would have a stock, and then when you needed to make the weapon compact, just fold it over. It's only about 25 inches with the stock folded, and it's about 32, 33 with it open. So after the siege of Leningrad and all of that, the Russia would continue to make these. They would make about 2 million during World War II. They would produce quite a few. It was well received. In fact, some called it the best submachine gun of World War II. It was very cheap to make, very reliable. It fired the powerful 7.62x25 Tokarev cartridge. We have a 10-inch chrome-lined barrel, and that's really about it. It's a very simple submachine gun. Not a whole lot of features to it. We've got a integrated muzzle brake here. We have a barrel shroud. We have a mag well, which can double as a foregrip. It feeds from a 35 round mag. Now these are not interchangeable with the PPSh41s because these are double stack, double feed. That does make them more reliable, and it also makes them easier to load. But the only downside is they're not interchangeable with the older PPSh41 mags. And these obviously can't take a drum because of the mag well they have. We have a manual safety here. Very simple. This physically locked the bolt on the full auto. On the semi-auto, it also blocks the trigger. We have simple flip rear sights. Nothing at all special there, just regular sights. These are also pretty stiff on this one. But this is for close to medium range. These were never mass produced on the level of the PPSh41, but they were made in large numbers, and they were used more extensively after World War II by Russia. They were also licensed, produced in China as the Type 54. Poland, which this one's Polish, made a version called the WWII-43. Vietnam made a version called the K50M, and so on and so forth. So these were, better received throughout the Warsaw Pact than earlier, because it's more of a, by the 1950s, it was a more modern submachine gun, a third generation style submachine gun, cheaper and compact. But it did its job very well. The reason you don't see many submachine guns in Russia following World War II is simple: the Kalashnikov. Mikhail began working on his design in 1943, 1944. It went into prototype stage around 1946 and went into mass production a few years later. And once you have an assault rifle, the utility of a submachine gun goes way down. So even though Russia did make submachine guns during the Cold War era, they were never even produced in anything like large numbers compared to the PPS and PPSh. I mean, you've got over 8 million submachine guns made in Russia during World War II, and that's why we're doing this video. Even though it's kind of a redux of some older material, the submachine gun was so important to Russia during that war. It allowed the Russians to have firepower, not unlike how the Sten gun allowed British soldiers to have a higher rate of firepower. A very similar concept. They were fast and easy to make, they were easy to train soldiers on, they were reliable, they were easy to maintain. There was a lot going for the submachine gun, and it wasn't until the assault rifle came out that they started to wane in utility and popularity. Specifically on this IO imported Radom PPS43, these are getting a little hard to find today in 2016. But they are an excellent, and at one time very affordable. When these were being sold new, they were under $400 with several accessories, including 3 or 4 mags, a cleaning kit, so on and so forth. What's nice is the majority of the parts, all the parts are Polish, which is good. And things like the barrel are original from the 1950s in this one's case. But just it was a really good buy and a very interesting gun, and these are actually quite reliable, with a few exceptions depending on ammo and just, a bad mag here and there. But just thought we would round out Red October with the Russian submachine gun. And sorry I don't have a PPD, even a semi-auto to show you, but maybe we can toss up some pictures, or I guess we already have if we're going to. But yeah, we really appreciate you tuning in and supporting the channel throughout this month. It was a lot of fun to make this series and really get into the Russian guns. I've kind of held off doing them until I could hopefully do it at least halfway right, because I find them very interesting and they're very special to me. But anyway, if you ever want to talk about Russian submachine guns or just Russian guns in general, let's chat down in the comments. And as always, this is Misha, and we really appreciate you tuning in.